Audio test. Testing. 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 Audio test. Testing. Testing. Testing.
Hi, Ida.
Hi, Gail. How are you?
I'm okay. More importantly, how are you guys doing? Okay, you're busy.
We are busy indeed, but so are you. We're all busy. We're all
Hi,
busy.
Margaret.
Margaret's here too. Excellent. Well, I
Yes,
should say,
I'm here. Hi, Edith.
excellent. Hi. I should just do a quick message to everyone who's in the webinar tonight that we will get started very shortly. It's 6:25 right now. So we'll wait till certainly 6:30, the official start time. And we've got a great turnout tonight, I believe. Got over 100 people signed up, and then I'm sure we'll get a lot more attending by live stream.
Great.
Yep.
Hope everybody's well.
Hanging in.
Yep.
You too, I hope. Yep.
I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm doing well.
I'm crazed.
You're crazed.
Wow.
Where's Carl taking care of you, Gail? Huh?
He just brought me up some cheese, crackers, and grapes.
Oh, that's not good enough.
That's plenty. That's what I was looking for. Oh my God.
Oh, well, Alan is going to make dinner for me. Like he do practically every day.
That is very nice, Margaret Chin. He should still be chancellor, however.
Well, he's volunteering. He was teaching a music class today to students of PS3, his
Here,
former
somebody-
school. And I have to keep listening to this. Oh, Gail. Oh. Guess we'll start in a couple of minutes.
I'm so hungry. Wow.
We'll start in a few minutes. I have 6:27 right now.
Mm.
Hi, folks. For those who are just joining, we have a couple more minutes. It's 6:28 right now. So let's wait till 6:30 and we'll do an official greeting of hello and some intro remarks. Thank you. Hi, everyone. 6:29 right now. We'll give it another minute and we'll start at 6:30. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. It's 6:30. I think we should get started. Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining this evening for this important discussion on SoHo, NoHo, and housing. My name is Ida Sue Chen. I am the director of the Manhattan office at the Department of City Planning. Tonight's event is one in a series of public information sessions hosted by us at City Planning in partnership with Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer and Councilmember Margaret Chin. As our focus tonight is housing, we are joined by our city partner, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD. Future sessions will provide discussion on other topics that are near and dear to the SoHo and NoHo neighborhoods, such as quality of life and arts and culture. Tonight's event is organized in 3 sections. We have introductory remarks from our co-hosts. We will have a substantive presentation from the DCP and HPD team, and then a question and answer session where we respond to questions posed directly by you. We know the subject of housing is so important to you, to all of us. So we want to spend the time to get into the issue and answer your questions. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. Your input and participation make up the keystone to developing this neighborhood plan. So we've got a great turnout tonight on Zoom, and I assume also on live stream. So before we get to the presentation, let's hear from our honorable co-hosts, Borough President Gail Brewer, and then Councilmember Margaret Chin. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Edith, and thank you to City Planning and to Housing Preservation and Development. Perhaps of all three of your discussions, this might be the most important. It certainly is for the Borough of Manhattan. And to talk about affordable housing, mandatory inclusionary housing is very, very apropos for the time that we're living in. And I want to thank my colleague, Councilmember Margaret Chin. We have worked on many projects together, and I appreciate her input. So I think we all know that my office, staff, the council member, the agencies, we've all been assessing the neighborhood plan proposed by City Planning Commission. I did submit my comments to the project's draft scope of work on December 18th, as you might know. And I did note a number of important improvements that have to be made, I feel, to the proposal. We all know, as I said earlier, housing is perhaps the most important issue in our city right now. And no one disagrees that retaining and creating new affordable housing in these neighborhoods, as well as across the city, is a goal we all want to achieve. I have not been quiet about the need for deeper affordability, as well as the need for providing affordable housing opportunity for artists. And that's a challenge, and I don't know why it is a challenge, but it seems to be. SoHo and NoHo have very intelligent and engaged residents and stakeholders. And I thank you for not only the meetings that we have sponsored, but the ones that you have sponsored. And I'm sure you will bring up your concerns as they pertain to affordable housing. As I said, and as Edith Suchen also mentioned, this public meeting is the first of three to provide information about issues that have come up at previous hearings on this project and discussions around the draft scope of work. And we know that future meetings will talk about mixed use and quality of life, as well as arts and culture. So I know that you will join the other two as well as this one when their dates are released. But please ask as many questions as possible. And let's see if we can make this a project that we can all be proud of. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gail. Margaret.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to our borough president, Edith. Thank you to DCP and HBD for joining us in this important information session for NoHo and SoHo. There've been a lot of meeting, a lot of public engagement, and today's topic is on housing, which is, as our borough president said, is critical to our city and to this neighborhood. How do we make sure that we preserve affordable housing, especially for the pioneers who have built this neighborhood, the artists who've been living in this SoHo, NoHo neighborhood for a long time. At the same time, how do we create new affordable housing, new opportunity, so that more people will have the opportunity to be in this wonderful artistic, cultural neighborhood? We have heard a lot of feedback from our constituents regarding housing, proposed, where could they be located in this area. So I really encourage everyone to participate, to ask questions, because this session is modified to allow for more direct participation, engagement. Once again, I really wanted to thank all of you for participating today, and especially, thanks to City Planning and our borough president and HPD for hosting this evening session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Borough President and Council Member. Now, actually, before we go into the presentation, we're going to hear a bit from Gigi Lee.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Gigi Lee. I'm the Chief of Staff for Council Member Margaret Chin. Before we dive into the presentation, I'd just like to make two quick comments to note that for Cantonese and Mandarin speakers, that we're going to try our best to provide assistance tonight. 喺今晚嘅提問環節，如果你係需要廣東話翻譯嘅話咧，我會幫你翻譯問題同回答。So that was Cantonese, and now I'll just quickly try to say the same thing in Mandarin. 在提问环节，如果你需要普通话翻译 ，Sylvia 会帮你翻译问题和回答。So with that, I will turn it over to Sylvia.
Thank you, Gigi. I'm Sylvia Lee, the project lead of SoHo NoHo Neighborhood Plan at the Department of City Planning. Thank you for taking time out of your day to attend the Zoom event. For those who are watching the YouTube live stream, thank you also for tuning in. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping notes. For those of you who joined our October 26th info session, tonight's event will run similarly. So we'll start with a presentation, as Edith mentioned, and then dedicate the rest of the meeting to answer as many of your housing questions as possible. We heard loud and clear the desire to have a more interactive Zoom setup, so we've made a few changes for this meeting. During the presentation, if a question comes to mind, you can submit it by using the Q&A feature. Staff will collect the questions and queue them up for the live Q&A session. Once we start the live Q&A portion of the event after the presentation, you will then have two options to ask a question. You can continue to do so by typing in your question using the Q&A feature, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. If you are phoning in, press *9 to raise your hand to get in the queue. When your name is called, you will be able to use the buttons at the bottom left corner of your Zoom screen to unmute yourself. And this time, you have the option to turn on your camera as well, if you'd like. We will alternate between written questions and those who want to ask a question verbally. Next slide, please. After the presentation, the chat feature in Zoom will also be enabled so that you can interact with one another. Again, if you want us to address a question and actually see the question, please put it in the Q&A box instead of the chat. The technical hotline info can be found on this slide, as well as at the bottom of every slide in case you need technical assistance. Next slide. So here's what our presentation will cover. We'll take about 30-40 minutes or so. After a quick recap of housing-related zoning strategies in the neighborhood plan, I will then turn it over to my colleague, Michael Sandler from the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD. The idea is to put our neighborhood plan for SoHo NoHo in the context of our city and to provide some more information on housing. Next slide, please. Michael and I will do our best to address some of the frequently asked questions related to housing, density, and mandatory inclusionary housing during the presentation, and we'll answer questions afterwards. Again, please feel free to submit written questions as we go along. Next slide, please. Next slide. As you know, Edith alluded to, tonight's session is the first one of a series of public events to flesh out different aspects of the neighborhood plan. Tonight, we're talking about all things housing. Future sessions will be centered around other important topics such as mixed use, quality of life, arts and culture. For each session, we'll bring relevant agencies to the table to share information and answer your questions directly. Tonight, again, we're joined by HPD. In future sessions, our colleagues at the Department of Transportation, Department of Sanitation, Culture Affairs will also join us to support these interconnected public dialogues. I'll reiterate that the neighborhood plan is a work in progress. Your questions tonight in the future, as well as your feedback, will continue to shape the plan as it comes together. And we thank you for taking the time to stay involved. Next slide, please. As we've covered in numerous previous events, the existing manufacturing zoning in SoHo NoHo is outdated. And importantly, it really stands in the way of adding new housing in a neighborhood that should accommodate more of it. Other than the unique artist live-work, joint living work quarters for artists, and units covered by the loft law, residential use is not a permitted use in zoning. There is no affordability requirement. What these zoning impediments have translated to on the ground is that one, the access and availability of the existing housing stock in SoHo, NoHo is very limited. And two, because of the zoning barriers, SoHo and NoHo has not added lots of new housing in recent years, despite the citywide needs and the rich amenities and opportunities the neighborhood offers. And thirdly, the limited number of homes that have been created through the lengthy and costly discretionary approvals, such as the City Planning Commission special permits and the BSA variances, is really a drop in the bucket and have only produced market rate units. Next slide, please. The SoHo NoHo neighborhood plan will change that. First and foremost, the rezoning will allow housing. This means new housing can be built as a right and existing space may be converted to housing. In conjunction, the allowable densities will be adjusted to better reflect existing built context and be commensurate with SoHo NoHo's central location and excellent transit access. We heard from many of you that density should be carefully calibrated to balance various planning goals, including maximizing housing, supporting jobs, and be respectful of historic preservation and the character of the neighborhood. While not the focus tonight, we are digesting these comments and are working to refine the proposal. The rezoning will also implement mandatory inclusionary housing MIH program to require permanently affordable housing as part of new residential development and conversions. We've got also a lot of questions about MIH, including how the program and requirement work and for whom these units are affordable. Michael will speak to many of them in his presentation. Here, I'll simply highlight that in SoHo NoHo, where we lack city-owned land to build 100% affordable housing ourselves, and where land value is high and the market is strong, MIH is one of the most critical and useful tools we have in our toolkit to support housing affordability and equity. Last but not the least, recognizing the important tradition of live work in SoHo NoHo and the changing landscape of live work, the new zoning will provide flexible options. We've got a lot of questions about this as well. So essentially, existing JLWQA, joint living work quarters for artists, and live work by certified artists can remain. New residential units, be it converted or newly constructed units, will accommodate but not require home offices and studios and other types of work options with less stringent limitations than your typical homes in residential neighborhoods. The idea is really to both accommodate what is already here and extend that allowance as an option to more people and more types of live-work arrangements, modeling after similar provisions in other mixed-use districts that we know work well. Related to this, we know many of you have questions about the mechanism for those who want the option to transition existing JLWQA to residential use. I'll say that this is arguably one of the more complicated components of the neighborhood plan, and it also relates to both housing as well as the legacy and the future of the arts in SoHo NoHo. I wish I had more to share tonight, but we're still working on the specifics, and we'll dedicate time to share more on this important issue in a future session. Next slide, please. So before I turn it over to HPD, I'll end on why it is critical that we move forward with the SoHo NoHo neighborhood plan now more than ever. We have the great challenge, as well as the great opportunity here to come together and plan for the future of these two beloved neighborhoods, and plan it with the intention of addressing both the needs of the local community as well as the needs of our city and all New Yorkers. As Michael's presentation will further highlight, if we look at SoHo NoHo against the backdrop of our city, it is imperative that high opportunity neighborhoods such as SoHo NoHo play a bigger role in addressing systemic inequities in the city's housing crisis. Next slide, please. With that, I will turn it over to Michael.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, and thanks for having me, DCP. My name is Michael Sandler. I'm the Director of Neighborhood Planning at the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. I'm going to be talking about affordable housing for the next 25 minutes or so. We're going to start really broad and wide, and then we're going to narrow in to the details of SoHo, NoHo, and this proposal as we go. And I'm going to attempt to do a fancy Zoom thing and control my own. All right, so I think folks talk about New York City's housing crisis as if it is a singular thing, when in reality, New York City has a variety of problems related to housing that come together to form the existing conditions that we have right now. These are distinct and overlapping crises, and each one takes its own set of solutions. So I'm going to go through these really quickly. The presentation has a lot of data in it, and it's going to be posted online so folks can spend time themselves after the meeting going through this if there's anything that you miss as I go through it. So first is an issue of low incomes of New Yorkers. Families that have the lowest incomes cannot afford rents that support the cost of operating the building, and I'm going to get more into this in a second. So for households that have the lowest incomes in New York, preventing homelessness, ensuring that New Yorkers live in safe and high quality housing really requires subsidizing housing for these families and individuals. At the same time, we have a limited supply of housing. In the last 20 years, we've added a lot more new people and new jobs to the New York City region than we have housing units. And we're part of a large regional housing and jobs economy that is really not functioning to create as much housing as we need right now. This housing shortage is experienced by all New Yorkers. Anyone who's looked for a new home in the last 10 years has experienced this with crowded open houses, applying for housing and finding that actually someone's already snatched up that apartment that you just saw, a few minutes ago. And this crunch, this lack of enough housing for New Yorkers affects even moderate income households. So it's a sort of a different and separate issue from the issue I just described with low income individuals. We also have segregated and unequal neighborhoods in New York City. New York City is the most diverse city in the United States, but discrimination and segregation in our neighborhoods persist. Our segregated neighborhoods are rooted in our history of racist laws, policies, and practices, which existed for the entirety of New York City's history. And there are clear connections between a New Yorker's race, where they live, and their access to opportunity, and real disparities in access to quality services and amenities across neighborhoods that stem from this history. Another issue that we have concurrent to this is the crisis of homelessness. Each night, there are nearly 60,000 people sleeping in the city's shelter system, including about 18,000 children. The high cost of housing is one of the primary causes of homelessness in New York City, though it is not the only cause. And at the same time, we have an underinvestment in public housing. NYCHA supplies 8% of New York City's rental housing stock. But it comprises about almost 80% of apartments in New York City with rents that are less than $500 a month. And this critical stock of housing for low-income New Yorkers has suffered from decades of federal housing subsidies that have favored middle-class home ownership over public housing, which has left NYCHA with $40 billion in capital repair needs. There isn't any public housing in SoHo or CB2, and so we're not going to get too into this tonight, but this is an issue that sits concurrent to the other issues that we're working to solve tonight. So first, I'll go a little bit more into details about the mismatch between the amount of rent that a low-income household can pay and the cost of a building. So the average cost to operate an apartment in New York City is over $1,000 per month. This is the cost really just to keep the lights on. This does not include debt service or profit to a landlord. 1 in 4 households in New York City earn less than $30,000 a year, which means that they can afford, the rent that household can afford should be less than $600 a month. And that gap between that $600 and that $1,000 is something that is really important for subsidies to essentially fix that in order to prevent severe rent burden, homelessness, or unsafe housing conditions. We have really high levels of rent burden in New York City. We're going to talk a little bit more about what rent burden means later in this presentation. And I'm not going to get into the details of this chart. You can kind of look at it later. But about 30% of New York City households spend more than half of their income on rent. And that really deeply impacts people's lives and their ability to use their earnings for other aspects of their life. This problem is particularly acute for low-income New Yorkers. 40% of low-income New York City households spend more than half of their income on rent. And when I say low-income in this sense, and on this chart, I'm talking about the left two bars of this chart. This is the red section of these left two bars. So we talked a little bit about a housing shortage. I think New Yorkers feel that there's new buildings getting built everywhere. And it's, as our experience walking around the city, that is often what you experience. But in reality, the housing production that we've had over the last 2 decades really doesn't match the amount of housing that was produced in other periods of economic prosperity in New York City's history. And so you can see here housing production by decade. And while in the last 2 decades, we have produced a significant number of housing units, this is not really made up for demand. It doesn't match other periods of our history. And you see that we're not keeping up with peer cities. The orange bar here shows the per capita housing production. So the amount of new housing that's produced in relation to our population. And you see that we're actually behind San Francisco, Miami, Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., and a lot of other large cities, including some cities that you think of as also having housing production issues like San Francisco. So the housing that we have produced over the last 20 years, and actually this chart is showing 10 years, is not evenly spread throughout the city. In Manhattan, you see significant housing growth almost exclusively in former non-residential areas that were rezoned to allow housing, as in Hudson Yards, West Chelsea, Riverside South. And you actually have a net loss in some historic districts, including parts of the Upper East Side, West Side, Greenwich Village, and SoHo, NoHo. So on this chart, or on this map, excuse me, the darkest blue are where the most housing has been created in the last 10 years, and the orange is where we've actually had a reduction in the amount of housing. And you see that Community District 2, this is just zoomed in on that same map. Community District 2 lagged most of the city's community districts in housing unit gains. It was 48 out of 49 community districts, despite being in the region's core. So I think everyone knows that conditions have changed a lot in the last year. We're having this meeting. I'm coming to you from my apartment, which I would not have done a year ago. Changes in the New York City housing market and our housing needs could be profound as a result of the COVID pandemic. But it's important to know that the way things look today in February may not be the way things look even in a couple months. And these changes are really going to take time to play out and to understand. Underlying this, though, is that the fundamental conditions of our housing crises, as I just described, most of which remain. New Yorkers could not afford housing costs before the pandemic, and now many of them have lost jobs or a portion of their income. There are over 1 million New York City residents who filed for unemployment this year or this past year. And so the needs for affordable housing are more acute than they have ever been. And as we think about this conversation and think about a rezoning, it's important certainly to consider the immediate needs and our needs here in 2021, but also really need to think about a long-term framework for equitable development, especially when we're talking about zoning changes. These changes take time to occur, and zoning is designed to be in place for 30 to 50 years. The current zoning in SoHo has been around since the 1970s, and we would hope that new zoning would similarly last. And so we're really thinking not about the immediate needs of today, but about a long-term framework for where should there be housing allowed and what should that housing be. So I'm going to transition. I'm going to go through quickly what is affordable housing. What do I mean when I say that? What do other people mean when they say that? And then we're going to dive into SoHo specifically. So first, housing is considered affordable when a household spends no more than 1/3 of their income on rent and utilities. This standard has changed over time. It hasn't always been considered this. And for many families, especially the families with the lowest income, even spending 1/3 of their income can be quite a burden. But just to illustrate what 1/3 of someone's income looks like and how that translates to a monthly rent, if your gross income is $20,000, that means your rent should be less than around $600 a month. And if your gross income is $100,000 a year, that means your rent should be less than around $2,500 a month. So when you say affordable and affordable room, it's really important to understand that it's relative to a household's need, and affordable to one household may not be affordable to a different household. There's a lot on this slide. I'm going to go through it slowly, or slowly for me. You may be able to tell I'm a fast talker. So there are different types of housing that people refer to as quote unquote affordable housing. And I'm going to go through each of these different ones and what they mean. So first you have unregulated or private market housing. This is privately owned housing that may be affordable to some families. Sometimes people call this naturally occurring affordable housing. This next column kind of shows what gets regulated. So in this case, nothing is regulated. This is not subject to any regulation. It just happens to be affordable housing that's affordable, to lower income families. And does this exist in SoHo, NoHo? I would say no, we do not really have unregulated or private market affordable housing in this neighborhood. You've also got public housing. So unlike the last category, this is publicly owned and operated housing. It's managed by the New York City Housing Authority. And both income eligibility, who is allowed to live and who that housing serves, and the rents that are charged in that housing are regulated by NYCHA and HUD. And do we have this in SoHo, NoHo? We do not. Then there is rent stabilized and rent controlled housing. So this is privately owned multifamily housing, most often built before 1974, in which tenants are protected from sharp increases in rent and have a right to renew their lease. Rents here are regulated by rent stabilization law or other New York State laws like the loft law. And in this case, just rents are regulated, not the income eligibility of who can live in this housing. And is this here in SoHo? Yes, we do have this type of housing here in the SoHo area, SoHo, NoHo areas. And then you've got what I call really wonky term, government assisted housing. This is kind of what people often refer to as kind of capital A affordable housing. This is privately owned buildings that receive public subsidy or other benefits in exchange for providing income restricted housing with affordable rents. So this would be buildings that are subsidized by HPD, 100% affordable buildings, or also could include things like inclusionary housing that has restrictions on both income eligibility and the rents that are governed by a regulatory agreement between the government and the owner of that building. And we do not currently have any government assisted housing. There's no income qualified affordable housing in the SoHo, NoHo rezoning area. And then this last category, I have it as a different color because it is somewhat overlapping with these other categories. And this is rental assistance. These are federal, state, and city programs which pay for all or part of the rent on behalf of a tenant. Programs like housing choice vouchers or Section 8 or city FEPs are commonly used in New York City, and these can be used in some of these other types of affordable housing as well. And so they may be layered between these two types. And for rental assistance, both income eligibility and rents are regulated depending on the voucher source by different agencies. And it is likely we do not have a lot of, although I can't confirm tonight whether or not there are folks using rental assistance in the SoHo, NoHo area. Folks, I'm sure many folks have heard of area median income, and it's certainly a hot topic. I want to do a little bit of myth busting and just kind of explain what that means. And this is going to be important. Come back later in the presentation when we talk about mandatory inclusionary housing. So the area median income is determined each year by the federal government for different regions. For the New York City metro area, the area median income is $102,000 for a family of 3. Note that I do specify here for a family of 3, the area median income is actually adjusted based on household size. So there's different area median incomes for different household sizes. There are a lot of folks who I think have been told or believe that the formula that calculates area median income is what is determining the income eligibility for housing in New York City. That is not true. The City of New York, HPD, other agencies that create affordable housing use this number as a reference point and set our own income requirements that are tailored to the needs of New Yorkers. The underlying mechanics of creating subsidized housing are providing subsidy in order to make up the difference between the rents that a low-income family are able to pay with the cost of operating and building that building. The formula that creates AMI does not change that underlying dynamic. The slide here is illustrating how different types of households are in relation to the area median income. And so eligibility for affordable housing in New York City and around the country is determined based on sort of a percent of the area median income. So you might have a 30, these are all showing households of 3. So you might have a retail salesperson and 2 dependents earning 30% of the area median income, or around $30,000, or a caseworker and a home health aide, and a dependent who earn 80% of the area median income, or $81,000 a year, both of which could be eligible for different types of affordable housing in New York City. So I'm not going to go through too much detail on this slide, but this shows how both those household sizes and apartment sizes relate to area median income and translate to rents that people pay. So you might have, for example, I'll start with this 2-bedroom apartment, the same 2-bedroom apartment in a government-assisted affordable housing building where 2 different families that have different household sizes and AMIs are paying different rents. So you could have a family of 2 who earn 50% of the area median income, or $45,000 a year, and their rent could be around $1,100 a month. Or in that same 2-bedroom apartment, you could have a household that earns 40% of the area median income, or around $41,000 a year. We're paying $850 a month. And we went online, we looked at just street easy listings that are currently available in the SoHo, NoHo area, just to give a comparison for the type of market asking rents that are available today in this neighborhood. And they are, as you can see on the slide, astronomical in relation to those affordable rents. So for a studio in the area today, we saw listings that averaged $2,300 a month. And for 3 bedrooms, over $12,000. And this is after we actually removed outliers. We removed apartments that were particularly exorbitant in their cost. So just one more example here for a 1-bedroom, an 80% area median income household, around $73,000 a year, would pay $1,500 in rent in affordable housing. So I'm going to zoom into SoHo, and then we're going to talk about the city's housing strategies here. I'm going to go through a bunch of data, again, relatively quickly. So first, we'll start with income. Most of these charts are going to show the SoHo, NoHo area compared to Manhattan and the city overall. In terms of income, whereas around 41% of New Yorkers earn less than $50,000 a year, only 17% of SoHo, NoHo study area residents earn in that range. So there are definitely SoHo, NoHo residents who are low income. 17% is a not insignificant number, but in relation to the city overall, this is a quite wealthy area. Illustrated again on the $200,000 or more category, where only 11% of New Yorkers earn in this range, but nearly half, 41%, or 2 out of 5 SoHo households earn more than $200,000 a year. In terms of race and ethnicity, you'll see that the SoHo, NoHo study area is significantly whiter than the city overall, whereas 32%, roughly a third of New Yorkers are white. Nearly 80% of SoHo, NoHo study area residents are white. And you see very low proportions of Black and Hispanic New Yorkers in the SoHo study area in relation to New York City. And I should just, for folks who are having any difficulty with the charts, the blue bar is showing, in all of these, is showing SoHo, NoHo. The red bar is showing Manhattan, and the orange bar is showing New York City. There is also a higher proportion of higher proportion of owners to renters than in the city overall. So it's roughly half and half owners and renters in the SoHo, NoHo study area. 47% owners, 53% renters. In Manhattan, only 25% of Manhattan residents own their home, 75% rent. And in New York City, it's about 1/3, 2/3, 1/3 renters, 2/3 owners. When we look at median sales price and rent, so what are housing costs in this area, I'll note these 2 charts are for all of Community District 2. We could not get data at such a granular level that we felt confident represented the study area specifically. So we're showing CB2. So sales prices, the median sales price in Community District 2 is $1.5 million. This has actually gone down a little bit in the past couple of years compared to nearly around 680,000 citywide. Certainly a $680,000 apartment is not affordable. So, apartments in all of New York City are not affordable, but are particularly unaffordable in Community District 2. And for rent, we see the same dynamic where rents in CB2 are nearly double that of rents in the city overall. So this chart's going to take a little explaining. This is explaining the existing housing stock in the SoHo, NoHo neighborhoods. Residents of SoHo, NoHo know this dynamic well, and obviously know the apartments and what exists in this neighborhood. So first, I'm going to start on the top right, the blue group. These are joint live work quarters for artists. Approximately 1/3 of the housing units in the SoHo, NoHo area fit in this category. These were created by this 1970s era zoning for this area, originally reserved only for certified artists. Over time, legal occupancy has been extended to non-artist residents under certain circumstances. For this type of apartment, they are not subject to rent regulation. There is an occupancy restriction in terms of the occupation of who can live in these, but there is not regulations on their rent. Turning to the left side, these are loft law units. These were enabled by the 1982 New York State loft law. These include interim multiple dwelling, which is former non-residential spaces occupied by a residential tenant that is going through a conversion process with the Department of Buildings, and former interim multiple dwellings, which are, they used to be interim multiple dwellings, and they've gone through this process of conversion. Some of these homes are rent regulated based on the loft law. So certain rental interim multiple dwellings have essentially rent control, and former interim multiple dwellings, around 300 of them in the neighborhood, are rent stabilized. And there's no artist occupancy requirement here or income eligibility requirement for these apartments. And then another third of the housing units in the neighborhood, about 1,700, are residential units. These are apartments that were approved via BSA or CPC special approvals, market rate homes, a subset of older apartments in the neighborhood, some tenements here and there, maybe rent regulated based on the New York State rent stabilization law, and there's no artist occupancy requirement. And then there's the small gray area are units that actually are part of one of these three, but that the data we had to pull together this chart does not indicate. We don't have enough data on each of those to place them in which category they are a part of. So what affordable housing exists in SoHo and NoHo? So first, just to be clear, there is no income restricted affordable housing in the SoHo NoHo study area. Back on my chart a few slides ago, this is that government assisted housing category. We looked a little bit wider at all of CB2. About 3% of homes in CB2 are government assisted affordable housing. That's about 1,800 housing units. About a third of those are in what are called HDFC co-ops, which are income restricted home ownership buildings, co-op buildings. Though are not necessarily what folks think of when the first thing folks think of when they think of affordable housing. They may not necessarily be particularly affordable, though many are. And about 7% of the affordable housing units that make up that 1,800 are in projects with inclusionary housing, mostly in the Hudson Square area. So bear with me with just a few more slides. We're going to talk about what are we doing based on these existing conditions. I'm going to start citywide and again narrow in to SoHo, NoHo. So first and foremost, we work to preserve existing affordable housing citywide. When we at HPD think about preserving affordable housing, we think about it in three main buckets. First is financing and safeguarding affordability. So really thinking about the rents that people are paying. We, the city, offer loans and tax incentives to building owners in exchange for keeping homes affordable for current residents. Since 2014, we've financed the preservation of 115,000 homes in New York City, though only 175 of those are in Community District 2, mostly as a result of the high cost of housing in New York, the high land values in high cost of housing in SoHo, NoHo, and CB2, and the lack of existing rent-regulated housing in the SoHo, NoHo area and CB2. And also when we talk about financing and safeguarding affordability, we think about improving public housing stock while safeguarding residents' tenancy rights and affordability. We also, when we think about preserving housing, are talking about protecting tenants. The city has a wide range of strategy. I have just 3 on this slide, but I could have a whole presentation about all the work the city is doing to protect tenants, but this includes a citywide tenant hotline and portal, a citywide right to counsel law passed by the city council, implemented by this administration, and new tenant anti-harassment unit at HPD. And then finally, on preserving affordable housing, we work to promote safe and healthy housing through rigorous enforcement of the housing code. Quick water break. So we also work to create new affordable housing. The city provides loans and tax incentives to facilitate the development of affordable housing citywide. Since 2014, through these mechanisms, the city has financed 52,000 new construction affordable homes in New York City. Of those, less than 1% were in Community District 2, again, as a result of the high costs of constructing housing in this area, of acquiring sites, and the high upside for an owner to do a market rate building instead of an affordable building. We work to prioritize the development of city land into affordable housing. Overall, about 1/3 of that new construction was on projects that involved publicly owned land. It's a very important tool for us to create new affordable housing. Unfortunately, there is very little developable city-owned land in Community District 2. And overall, citywide, over the last few years, we've been working to support community land trusts and other nonprofit developers, as well as MWBEs, as part of this ecosystem of developing and creating new affordable housing. And finally, and we're going to talk more about this in a minute, we work to implement mandatory inclusionary housing to require affordable housing along with new housing growth. You'll see that this is not our only housing strategy, as I've just described, but for the SoHo, NoHo area, is a very important one that we'll talk through in a second. So just quickly thinking about the SoHo area and our SoHo, NoHo area and our opportunities and constraints. So first, as I've mentioned multiple times, there are high land costs and high market rent, which make affordable housing tools such as loans and tax incentives not feasible here. There's also a lack of existing income restricted affordable housing as part of this ecosystem, and a lack of city-owned land to build 100% affordable housing. On our opportunities, we have the ability to rezone to allow housing. Where there's not housing allowed now, we can legalize infill development and conversion of existing buildings to housing. We can require permanent affordable housing via mandatory inclusionary housing on private sites. And we will be continuing to identify opportunities for publicly owned sites in this area and in the broader CB2. It takes a lot of work to kind of unlock that land for affordable housing. And we will be working with TCP, DOB, and HCR to identify rent-regulated homes and ensure consistent enforcement of existing rent-regulated homes. So I'm going to talk more about mandatory inclusionary housing. I know folks really want to know more about this program. And then we introduced the session tonight with sort of a question of why can't we increase the number of homes that we require to be affordable through MIH? Since new housing of all types are really critical to our city's future, the mandatory inclusionary housing program, which I'm now going to just say MIH from here on out, it was designed to balance creating as much income restricted housing as possible without disincentivizing the creation of housing overall. The rents that are collected from MIH units are not enough or not high enough to pay for the costs of maintaining that building. And so the market rate units in those buildings are essentially subsidizing those MIH units. At a certain point, if you require too many MIH units, the new building would no longer be financially feasible, and a property owner may pursue non-residential development or maintain existing uses of the site. So in this case, the end result would not be more affordable housing, it would be no affordable housing at all. And so the MIH program was designed based on a market study to identify this sweet spot where you get as many affordable homes as possible without tipping the balance, where you end up getting no housing at all. Members of the public can review this market study. It is posted on the city planning website. And I think we could probably get a link in the chat or in the Q&A for folks to help them find that. So how does the program work? First, during public review, during the ULURP process, the city council can choose to implement one or both of these two basic options. So the first one is that 25% of the housing in that new building has to go to households whose incomes average to around $61,000 a year, or 60% of the area median income. Within this option, there's an additional requirement that at least 10% of the building must serve those that earn 40% of the area median income, or around $41,000. So I'm going to explain, actually, I'm going to model how this plays out. And what I mean when I say that the incomes are averaging to 60% of the area median income in a second. But just before I get there, I'll explain all the options. And the rents in option 1 could range from $730 for a studio to $2,000 for a 2-bedroom and 80% AMI. Option 2. In this option, it requires more affordable housing. So a higher portion of the building has to be affordable housing, but serve slightly higher incomes at the same time. So around 30% of housing for households with incomes that average to around $82,000 a year, or 80% of the area median income. And rents could range from $1,500 to a studio to around $2,000 for a 2-bedroom in this option. I want to highlight the fine print on this slide, which is that sample incomes that I'm showing here are for a 3-person household in 2020 AMIs. And that rents in an MIH building would be determined based on the income limits in place at the time, whatever the AMI is at the time that building is built, and then the rents that match those AMIs. So in addition to these 2 basic options, the City Council can add 1 or 2 other options. If they do, these would apply along with one of the basic options, and developers in this area, in the area where it's mapped, would be able to choose between the 2 options. So option 3 requires less affordable housing, but for much lower incomes. So 20% of overall building for households with incomes averaging $41,000, or 40% of the area median income. In this case, subsidy is only allowed if new additional housing on top of that is provided. So for this option, rents could range from $730 for a studio to $930 for a 2-bedroom. So very deeply affordable, in particular in relation to rents in SoHo, but actually in relation to most parts of New York City. And I'm not going to talk about option 4 tonight. It's here, it's grayed out on this slide. Option 4 is not available in the Manhattan core. This was an option that is for different types of housing markets in different parts of the city. If you hear folks tell you that MIH serves households that earn over 100% of the area median income, this is not true. The only options that would be available in the SoHo, NoHo area are options 1 through 3, which go up to a maximum of 80% of the area median income, and most of which serve households which earn around $41,000 a year. So one final slide just to kind of bring it home in terms of how this plays out in a building. So here's an example building showing MIH option 1. This is a 100-unit building. So in this option, you would have 25 affordable apartments and 75 apartments that are market rate. Of those affordable apartments, as we said, that 10% of the building has to be for households that earn $41,000 a year. 40% of the area median income. So those would be 2 bedrooms, for example, that rent for $930. And as I said before, the building has to average, the affordable homes have to average to 60% of the area median income. So because of that tier at 40%, you also have a tier at 80%, or households that earn around $82,000 a year, and 2-bedroom rents of around $2,000. And then you would also have some apartments in the middle, households that earn 60% of the area median income, or around $61,000 a year, or $1,400 for a family, $1,400 for a 2-bedroom apartment. So that's how MIH works. This was a ton of content. This is it for my slides. I believe that we are going to take a 5-minute break, although I don't know if there's anything that Sylvia wants to add before we go to break.
No, that's it. Thanks, Michael, for the informative presentation. So we'll now take a 5-minute break and then come back for the live Q&A session. Thank you and see you soon.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Nabila Malik, and I'm a planner working on the SoHo NoHo team at City Planning. We'll go ahead and begin the Q&A session. And just please be aware that all participants will remain muted unless called on. We'll post all questions from this session on our website following the event. And you can always check our FAQ at nyc.gov/SoHo NoHo plan, which we update periodically with more answers. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just a reminder that if you speak Mandarin or Cantonese, we can help translate your question live. Next slide, please. So the way it will work today is that we will alternate between written questions we have been receiving and continue to receive through the Zoom Q&A feature, and from participants raising their hand and asking questions live. As Sylvia noted earlier, we are focusing on housing during this session, and so we will be prioritizing housing-related questions. We have received some questions for the Borough President and Council member, and I just want to note that City Planning and HPD are answering questions tonight. So Sylvia and Michael, who you just heard from, are on deck and ready to go for your questions. We do appreciate all of your questions though, and we'll answer as many as we can tonight, and then we'll be sure to relay any others after this event. Sylvia also noted that our other events happening during the next few months will focus on other themes like quality of life and arts and culture. So there will be more opportunities to ask other specific questions. Next slide, please. So based on feedback from our last session, we're working hard to mirror the benefits of in-person events during these virtual sessions. And to that end, when you are called on and given the ability to unmute, you'll also have the option to turn your camera on. Please be aware that to enable this option, your Zoom screen will close out and pop back up again. So don't be alarmed. It can take a few seconds for that to happen. And the same thing will occur once you're done asking your question. We ask that everyone respect the 2-minute time limit when speaking so that we can get to as many people as possible. And if you are dialed in tonight, you can press *9 to raise your hand. Next slide, please. So we want to ensure that this conversation is a pleasant experience for all. And we've also enabled the chat function now so that you may interact with your neighbors and other attendees. If you do have a question though, please ask it in the Q&A box or raise your hand. The chat is for attendees only. All right, so we'll begin the Q&A, and I'll start with 2 speakers, and then I'll go to 2 written questions. So first up, we have Ankur Dalal, and just note, Ankur Dalal, that your Zoom screen will close out and pop up again to enable your mic and camera.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. First, I wanted to commend HPD for their comprehensive presentation. The presentation makes it crystal clear that SoHo and NoHo are among the city's wealthiest, whitest neighborhoods with some of the lowest percentage of affordable homes, with median incomes that are far higher than the city and borough average, and far fewer forms of affordable housing than other neighborhoods offer. I appreciate the city noting that our city needs both more affordable more affordable housing and more market rate housing. And I appreciated that slide that showed that we build fewer homes than Seattle, DC, Miami, and San Francisco. And finally, I appreciated learning why the conditions in SoHo and NoHo make 100% affordable housing impossible, but how this rezoning and MIH can nonetheless create hundreds of new affordable homes in the area. The story of these statistics is why I strongly support the plan to change the SoHo NoHo zoning to provide for significantly more housing and more affordable housing. And I'm excited about the possibility that some of New York's greatest neighborhoods will be open to more people. My question is about how best to achieve this goal. Will HPD consider raising some of the residential densities that they've planned, perhaps to R10 outside of the core of NoHo and SoHo, and R8X or higher in the core parts of the district to ensure that as many homes as possible can be built? Thank you.
And Cora, thanks for your question. I'm Sylvia and I represent DCP, and I'll actually answer your question. First of all, appreciate your participation. This is a quick question and it came up here as well as previously at our scoping meeting. I think with regards to density, I think we want to make sure that we balance the various goals here, including kind of maximizing housing production, as you said, on private sites, as well as kind of making sure that we accommodate the density in a way that respects the historic character of 85% of the historic area of the study area, which are within historic districts. So we take cues from existing buildings in SoHo, NoHo within historic districts. We know that, a lot of the parts of Broadway and major corridors, parts of NoHo, we do have, some bigger buildings that have densities that are well beyond, what zoning allows today. So we'll increase that accordingly. And then outside of historic district, we are looking to maximize density. Again, we are still working on, fine tuning the proposal, and we'll make sure that we calibrate the density hierarchy in a way that, supports the city's housing goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Next, we will have Michael Levine.
Hello, and thank you for the excellent presentation today of information relating to affordable housing. My question relates to the different options that were presented. And Michael said in his presentation that the city council would choose, and it sounded as though he said one of the three options as to what would be available in the area that would be rezoned for residential use. We know from the proposal that we have seen and from what you have said, the different parts of SoHo, NoHo will be rezoned for different residential and mixed-use densities. My question is, how will the different options that would be available, 1, 2, or 3, be determined? Would it be a one-shot deal, a recommendation from the Department of City Planning when it files a ULAP application? Would it be a decision of the City Council if and when it adopts it? How would the different options be determined based upon the different floor areas that would be permitted in the different parts of SoHo, NoHo that would be proposed for rezoning?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Great question and great to see you. I can start, and Sylvia, if you have anything to add, feel free. So first, the same set of options would apply to the entirety of the rezoning area, regardless of the different densities within them. They would be mapped along with the zoning, and the different options would be enshrined in the zoning text related, I believe, to the special district. And they, in the past few rezonings, I believe that the city has proposed mapping all of the options, and it has been a subject of conversation as part of the public process.
Great, thanks, Michael. All right, so now we will switch to the written questions. And the first question I have here is, we need to preserve the architecture of this extremely important New York City neighborhood while we increase affordable housing. How can we work with developers and the city to enforce this? Michael, oh, sorry, Sylvia.
Thanks, Nabila. I think, you know, this question seems to be related to the question that I just answered. We agree that, you know, SoHo and NoHo are iconic historic neighborhoods. Like I said, 85% of the, you know, rezoning area are already city designated historic districts. So right now, as well as, you know, after the rezoning, the city's landmarks preservation commission's review, LPC's review, will still be required for any, you know, kind of significant alterations in new development. We look, you know, again, I think in order to support the city's housing goal and to unlock potential for new affordable housing and housing development on underutilized parcels, we want to make sure that we have the right density to accommodate those developments and to appropriately incentivize developments in terms of preservation and making sure that new development fit into the context of the historic character of the neighborhood. We look to use contextual zoning tools to make sure that, you know, the density is accommodated with good design and in building forms that mimic kind of the loft context that we so cherish in SoHo NoHo.
Thanks, Sylvia. The next question I have is, what percentage of new housing will be affordable? What percentage of affordable housing will be allocated to which different levels of AMI? What makes DCP think that the developers won't do everything they can to avoid construction of affordable housing while maximizing higher priced units?
Great question, and one we touched on in the presentation, but I'll go ahead and reiterate here. First, for MIH, there are different options. So in options one and three, both require apartments that are set aside for households who earn around $40,000 a year. And that would include 2-bedroom apartments for less than $1,000 a month. Option two allows for slightly higher incomes and rents, incomes that average to around $82,000, and apartments around $1,500 to $2,000 a month, but requires a higher portion of affordable homes, 30% as opposed to 25% for option one and 20% for option three. We'll have these slides online where you can see those written out. And I want to also just clarify my last answer, because I think it wasn't super clear, that we will be open to feedback from the SoHo NoHo community and folks citywide that are interested in what is the right option for the SoHo NoHo area. Oh, and on enforcement and how do we ensure that developers are held accountable to this? In order to get a building permit in an area where MIH is mapped, they need a certificate or a sort of certification from HPD that they have a plan and that they've met their requirements for, or they have a plan to meet their requirements for mandatory inclusionary housing. And then before they can get a a C of O, a certificate of occupancy for those new residential units, they have to get, again, a certification from HPD that they have met and fulfilled the obligations of mandatory inclusionary housing. And the requirements of mandatory inclusionary housing are recorded on a deed against that building. So even if the building changes hands or a new person owns that building, those underlying requirements for mandatory inclusionary housing remain. And I will add that HPD keeps a list of and a map on our website of all inclusionary housing units citywide, so that folks that are advocates in the community can check that and can see that these buildings are buildings where these affordability requirements should be applicable.
Thank you, Michael. We will go on to two attendees. So the first is Emily Hellstrom. And Emily, just be aware that your Zoom screen might pop in and out to enable the camera and mic.
Hi. Sorry, can you see me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, sorry. I was just jotting some notes, and I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation and for taking time to have a community session. I think that you know, some of these community sessions are difficult, and it is a new world with technology and things like that. So I really do hope that we can get back to in-person or some type of multifaceted, because there is really nothing like you know, access for all. But I do want to just mention, I've sat in many meetings. I'm the vice president of the SoHo Broadway Initiative, and listened to property owners, you know, who own commercial property, who keep assuring me that no one is going to build on top of any of these existing buildings, and that the only real way to make MIH work is to build up very high in order to recoup the money that it takes to create some of these buildings. And at the same time, I'm literally can look out my window. In fact, I can look out right now and see that there are 4 floors that go all the way through the building next to me of empty office space. They have been empty for easily the past 7 years. There are retail spaces that sit empty, and almost everyone I know wants to prevent SoHo from becoming sort of this unrecognizable wall of glass that is really no neighborhood at all. I also note that 2 Howard Street, which is in the catchment zone, is a sort of quasi city-owned, federally operated parking lot. It is ill-used and also could be used. So I think that there are real solutions here without upzoning. And I really hope that we can all start really coming to the table. This does not need to be rushed. If it's for, you know, the next 50 years, let's really do it right.
Great, thank you. Sylvia?
Sure. Thank you, Emily, and thanks for staying involved all this way. I will take a stab at this question about, you know, kind of housing opportunities that can be created through the conversion of empty office space. So I want to say that, you know, given the housing crisis, we do need to support housing production in every way we can. So allowing residential conversion is one piece of the puzzle, and it is a strategy that the SoHo NoHo neighborhood plan includes. So currently, because zoning does not allow residential use as of right, you can't really convert empty commercial manufacturing space to residential as of right without going through a very lengthy process. So I think that the part of the story that we're trying to tell here is that, you know, we want to fix that, and SoHo NoHo neighborhood plan will allow that to happen more easily. However, I just want to mention that, you know, conversion in and of itself is a complex issue and has its limitations, and that is related to, you know, buildings' physical characteristics as well as market conditions. You know, some buildings may also not lend themselves to residential conversions because of the floor plates and the lack of legal windows that can be created. In SoHo NoHo, where we now have an opportunity to kind of rethink the overall regulatory environment and to effectuate change and support housing in all ways that we can, we want to make sure that the right zoning and policies are in place to support both conversions and new housing. New construction is as important, if not more important, to address the city's housing shortage, which we believe is a persistent trend. I think Michael may be able to speak a little bit more about kind of the vacancy picture and kind of COVID landscape and whether or not that translates to persistent vacancies. But if I remember correctly, data shows that in the past decade, the city added over 200,000 new homes, and about 90% of them are new construction, and that is not enough to address the housing crisis. So with regards to kind of how we support housing, I think we need to look at both. I'll also mention that as part of conversions, mandatory inclusionary housing would also apply for conversions, which is another way that we hope to support affordable housing production in SoHo, NoHo, not just with new construction. And Michael, I don't know whether you want to talk a little bit more about the housing vacancy survey and the vacancy survey, and whether the vacancy issue is something that is relevant here.
Sure, and I'm sure we're going to get other questions about this tonight. I think that some news articles recently have claimed really high vacancy rates in parts of the city, in apartment vacancy rates. Although I know the question was also about commercial vacancy, but some news articles have claimed really high vacancy rates in parts of the city. The city relies on the New York City Housing Vacancy Survey, which is the only survey of residential vacancy that is representative of the diversity of New York City's housing stock. So from the HVS, we know that different types of housing have very different levels of vacancy. So for example, in 2017, the most recent HVS, the rental vacancy rate for apartments that rent for more than $2,500 was actually 8.7%, so relatively high. But for apartments with asking rents below $800, the vacancy rate is just 1.15%. So though we've heard a lot that everyone left the city, that there's tons of vacant apartments, we don't really know at this time. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat is popping up. We don't really know at this time whether the studies that we've seen that show high vacancy rates are actually representative of the diversity of New York City's housing stock. Many of them look just at the Manhattan core or just at properties that were in specific portfolios. People, they come from brokerage firms or things like that. So it's really going to take time to understand how residential vacancy has been impacted by COVID, and we're gearing up to do another round of the New York City Housing Vacancy Survey. And so, hope to have more data on this soon.
Great, thank you, Sylvia and Michael. All right, so we will move on to our second speaker, Marna Lawrence.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, because I disappeared there for a second. I've sent many questions already to the panel, but one of the things I wanted to talk about was how this meeting is being run. As with so many public hearings lately, for a long time due to the pandemic, and it's becoming more so though. In the beginning it was understandable, but now I don't think it's open. It's not in the spirit of the open meetings law. It's a dangerous time insofar as preserving social contracts is concerned. The Public Offices Law, Open Meetings Law is essential to keeping an open and democratic society. Undermining it in small or large ways at such a vulnerable time in our civic society is a dangerous thing to do. We don't even know how many people are attending this meeting. And we don't know who's attending this meeting. Before the pandemic, you go into a room and place and time, and you see who's there, and you even engage with people. And so the fact that we don't know, there's no way of seeing who's registered for this meeting or seeing who's attending this meeting is really a violation of the law. And I'm wondering if you can answer how that's going to change, at least for the DCP or, or moving forward. Because I understand it's very difficult, but there's got to be something else that's done, because it's really unfair for us to attend these meetings and not be able to know who's in attendance and see what other people are concerned about in real time. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Marna.
Want to take this on?
Sure. Thank you, Marna, and thanks for attending the Zoom meeting. And definitely appreciate the many challenges people face, during the pandemic. And we also would love to soon go back to the pre-pandemic world where we can all come together to have in-person meetings. That being said, one, you asked how many people are attending, and now I'm seeing 138 people are in attendance. And like we mentioned earlier, we understand the limitations of online meetings, and we heard the desire to have a more transparent, interactive platform. So now at today's sessions and future sessions, we'll have chat where you can say hi to your neighbors and interact with one another. You can turn on your video. So this is what we're trying to do and to make it better. With regards to the kind of open meetings law, I'm not a lawyer. I'll say that it is our view that remote public meetings are legal and appropriate. And given the many challenges folks face, the public health consideration, the fact that we've seen also as much, if not more, public participation in the virtual setting than our previous in-person meetings, to be honest. Yes, we've heard reservations about the virtual meeting setting, and we know that there are limitations, like I said, but I'll be remiss if I don't acknowledge that we've also heard from many who like and support the virtual meeting platform, and want that to be continued even after we resume to in-person meetings, as it is more accessible in many ways, and people can attend to their routines and other responsibilities, and it makes it easier to be civically engaged. So we remain confident that the city acted appropriately and continue to do so, and we're in compliance with the law. I'll also say that efforts like SoHo NoHo neighborhood plan and other planning initiatives are important to continue, and these are initiatives that lie at the heart of our pandemic recovery. And we look forward to working with you and on a rezoning proposal that our city can be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. So I just wanted to give a few reminders. One, you can continue asking questions in the Q&A. We're trying to get to as many people who have raised their hands, as well as questions we've received through the Q&A feature as possible. So we really appreciate your patience. And another reminder is the chat is for you all to interact with one another. If you do have a question, though, definitely put it in the Q&A box instead. And if you are dialing in to raise your hand, you can press *9. So now we'll move on to written questions. The first one is, how will the AIR, artist in residence status of loft buildings be changed under the rezoning? It was highlighted during our many community-based exploratory meetings, but the language in the proposal could not be more vague.
Thanks for the question, and thanks, Nabila. I'll address that. I think this is asking about, artists in residence, which is a, earlier name for joint living work quarters of artists. I think, as I've mentioned earlier, for those who, certified artists and other, types of legal residents who wish to remain and continue occupy their units as joint living work quarters of artists, they may continue to do so. So JLWQA as an existing use will continue to be permitted. I also mentioned that, we are still developing the specifics of the mechanism. I know a lot of people are waiting to hear more about it. The mechanism to support for those who want the option, the conversion from a JLWQA to a regular kind of residential unit. We're working on the details, and we will dedicate some time in a future session to share more on that. It's likely to be, like I said, it's one of the more complicated aspects of the neighborhood plan, and we want to get it right. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Sylvia. All right, the next written question submitted is, why is the city not looking to develop affordable housing in more affordable areas that need more development? Not force development through rezoning in high-cost historic areas that are fully developed. It seems like a lot of effort and money for little impact by overall units. Relative to other parts of the city, SoHo doesn't seem like it wants or needs development at higher density, but has welcomed new development where permitted to be more affordable. Nor should it be required to rezone to make up for the city's failure over decades to diversify its housing options across the 5 boroughs. Michael, do you want to take that?
Sure, and that's a really important question. I think that first and foremost, the city has pursued development in a wide range of neighborhoods. Existing affordable housing that's financed around the city is highly concentrated in areas with lower land costs. And for many folks, that is actually a problem that has concentrated our affordable housing in certain neighborhoods. And for folks that are eligible for affordable housing, that really limits the number of neighborhoods and the types of neighborhoods in which they can live. The city recently released our final Where We Live NYC plan, which looks at patterns of housing development and segregation and disparities in access to opportunity as a result of patterns of segregation, and finds that the city's affordable housing investments over decades concentrated in certain neighborhoods has helped to shape our segregated neighborhoods. So it's really important that we are creating affordable housing, not just in neighborhoods where the land costs are low or where people want the affordable housing or want new housing, but in all neighborhoods of the city. And it certainly shouldn't be one person's aesthetic choice that drives where low-income New Yorkers can live, or their desire, one neighbor's desire to have low-income housing in their neighborhood or not, really can't and should not shape, though throughout the city's history has shaped the location of where development has occurred.
Thanks, Michael. All right, moving on to our speakers. First, we have Pete Davies with his hand raised. And Pete, just a reminder that your Zoom screen may close out and pop back up again. So don't be alarmed. Pete, are you there? Are you unable to unmute yourself? Okay, it looks like we may have lost Pete.
Okay, sorry about that.
There you are.
Thank you. Yes, this is just one example of the problems of Zoom, but I'm not going to waste my time on that. Mr. Sandler mentioned that 311 rent stabilized units came out of IMDs. I'd like to know where he got that number. Two, let me start my video here. Hopefully you can see me, yes. And you'll see that I'm wearing what is the mechanism. And I think you all know that this question has been asked since 2015. How do we get these units converted in a way that is workable? It was part of the plan issued in draft form in 2019. It was part of the SoHo recommendations over a year ago. I understand it's complicated, but the fact that there is no answer to that question, what is the mechanism, which will have likely financial implications for a good number of people who live here, who've lived here for a long time, it's really not acceptable that in this late date, we still have no information. Sylvia, with due respect, if you could tell us when we will know this, and are you discovering financial implications that are going to be impacted upon the people who have been here for a long time? This is really important. I'd also like to know, why weren't these slide presentations presented before this meeting? You really can't expect that the rapid fire from presentation was absorbable in any fashion that we could come up with good questions for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete. So I'll have Michael start on the response.
Great, thank you, Pete. And I do recognize I talked fast and we went through a lot of content. We will be posting the slides from this presentation, and this is a long process. I imagine that I'll be back to give a follow-up presentation any day now, and would be happy to come back and review this material again at another date. On the 300 units that was mentioned in that slide, so that was explaining the different types of IMDs in the neighborhood. There are currently 311 IMDs that are subject to rent stabilization. 311 former IMDs that are subject to rent stabilization. This is from the Department of Buildings. From the Loft Board. The Loft Board actually has on their website a map of all current and former IMDs along with their status, and it's from this publicly available information that we were able to get that information. As folks know, former IMDs can be rent stabilized if they are tenant occupied rather than owner occupied, and if the tenant did not accept a buyout offer at some point over the last 40 years. And then there are also rents controlled current IMDs, we didn't share in the presentation the number of those, and we're currently working with the Department of Buildings and DCP to kind of compile this. I know that we've gotten some requests to have a better accounting and transparency about the data here and about what currently exists, and we're working on that and are eager to share that in the future. And I'll pass it to Sylvia to handle really the bulk of your question, though I will say I love the hat.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Pete. I just saw a chat pop up and you were raising some additional questions and issues with regards to the data. Again, like Michael said, we are not the custodians of that data, and we are working with the Loft Board to get as much information as possible. So if there is error in the data, we'll work to kind of cross-reference and resolve that and provide a better kind of picture of the rent regulated unit landscape here in SoHo NoHo. And with regards to the mechanism, I do hear you, and unfortunately I can say that we are working on developing the mechanism and the policies around it. I'll say that we are in conversations with other city agencies, including having conversations with Culture Affairs as well, DOB and others. Want to make sure that we create a mechanism that works, both kind of providing greater flexibilities in terms of what you can do with your JLWQA unit in the future, and also kind of finding ways to connect this change from JLWQA to residential use with other provisions that could support arts and culture and continue this legacy. I do hear you, but you know, we will have a dedicated session to talk about arts and culture, and this mechanism in JLWQA and the future of it will be discussed at that session. I think we're looking at different dates, and I think, you know, end of March is probably when we'll be able to have a session. But you know, before then, we're hard at work. Thank you for your understanding, and we're working on it.
Great, thank you. Our next speaker is Alida Camp. And Alida, we're gonna enable your mic and camera, so your Zoom screen might close out and pop back up again.
Thank you. This feels like a gift to developers, that for every 25 units of affordable housing, there will be 75 of market rate in an already very expensive neighborhood where the market rate housing could soar and have an impact on what's already there. Seems to me to be quite troubling. I'm wondering whether all affordable units, if there was some way to do that, would not be a much better fit for the community, because putting in market rate housing at $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 for a 3-4 2-bedroom apartment has an impact on land value and on leases and on the ability for small businesses to thrive. I live on the Upper East Side, and I've seen the devastation that to small businesses and affordable housing that unrestricted towers can bring. We have no affordable housing on the Upper East Side, and all of the towers and all of the increased height bring in no affordable housing, and we've lost more than 10,000 units. I can't see that this will be any different and that you will get the result that you want without really destroying neighborhoods with an influx of high income people to a historic area where you're trying to provide affordable housing. I'm not sure I'm as articulate as I would like to be, but this plan seems to need a whole lot more consideration before it goes into effect. And is this something that you anticipate completing, the idea of the rezoning, before this administration leaves office? Because we all know how much in favor this mayor is of upzoning despite objections from the community. So thank you. I did have a question in there someplace.
Sure, thank you, Alida, for your question. I believe the question was about, can we, do 100% affordable housing in the SoHo area, and why do we need market rate, and will market rate housing in SoHo drive up the cost of housing? I also just want to point out that you noted that there is too much housing on the Upper East Side and that there's not any affordable housing there. And I will note that there's more affordable housing on the Upper East Side, both more rent stabilized housing because there's more multifamily housing, and more income restricted affordable housing because of a legacy of housing development on the Upper East Side, which you do not have in the SoHo NoHo neighborhood, where you have very low densities and no housing allowed. With all respect, I think that most who study the issue would contend that the reasons that costs in SoHo NoHo, that apartments go for the 2-bedroom apartments go for $12,000 a month, is not because there's too many market rate housing units, but because there is frankly not enough. That the high cost of housing in SoHo is related to the dire scarcity of housing in SoHo. It is a neighborhood that is very desirable. People really want to live in this neighborhood and are willing to pay a premium to do so for the very few legal apartments that exist in the neighborhood. So building more housing of all types will, we believe, reduce this cost. And you do see this, that in buildings that are just outside of this area, some of the larger buildings that have been able to build, you do see lower costs than you see in the core of SoHo, where costs are very high. And as I noted earlier, that the mandatory inclusionary housing program is trying to balance multiple needs. So the need to create housing overall and the need to create income restricted affordable housing. The program relies on market rate housing, subsidizing the cost of lower income housing that has rents that are not high enough to pay for the construction of a building. Going back to the image I showed in my presentation of the $1,000 just to maintain the cost of a building every month in relation to many households who cannot pay $1,000 in rent. So if you increase the amount of affordable housing required above a certain point, you'll actually result in no housing, no affordable housing, no housing period. And so the MIH program was designed to try to hit, as I said, this sweet spot where you get some affordable housing without disincentivizing the construction of housing overall. And that program design was based on a market study that, as I said, anyone is welcome to read, and you can understand the inputs that went into creating the program.
Great, thanks, Michael. So now I'll turn it over to two written questions. So the first one is, for those of us who currently live in rent-stabilized apartments in the SoHo West zone, are we in danger of being displaced when the city mandates higher density affordable buildings?
Thanks for that question. I can start and maybe pass it over to Michael to address more, kind of what the city is doing in terms of tenant rights and protection. But I'll, clarify that, the city's the city's proposal doesn't, necessarily mandate higher density buildings to be built. I think it's creating an allowance for that to happen with inclusionary housing requirement. That being said, as part of the environmental review process, there is a requirement for us to carefully analyze, any displacement that may occur as part of the proposal. So that will be examined. I'll refer back to the point that Michael is making earlier, that given that the city is in a housing crisis and we lack housing overall, and we need the more housing we can build and produce over the long term, the less displacement pressure there will be on vulnerable populations and neighborhoods. Michael, I will turn it over to you to address the kind of tenant protection in rent regulated units, if you have more to add.
Sure. I mean, there's sort of infinite to say about the subject. The city does do a lot to work to protect tenants in rent stabilized housing. And I will also just first and foremost note the recently passed improvements to the rent laws in Albany that bring greater protection than ever for tenants in rent stabilized housing. There's existing currently in SoHo and CB2 generally, certainly a lot of pressure and a lot of upside for landlords to displace existing rent stabilized tenants. That's certainly a question of whether rezoning will increase that. My personal opinion would be that it wouldn't, and that incentive is so high already, given how high market rents are in the neighborhood. I'll talk quickly about some activities the city does to protect rent stabilized tenants. We, as I noted, have a new tenant resource portal, and free legal services for any tenants that are facing eviction in housing court citywide. And the city is taking a proactive approach to root out tenant harassment. We have a new tenant anti-harassment unit at HPD, which is staffed with lawyers who pursue action against landlords and take a data-driven approach to identify buildings that might be at risk of tenant harassment. We welcome referrals if there are issues, if there are concerns. We do have a hotline for tenants so they can contact us directly, and also community-based organizations can directly contact HPD through a proactive preservation initiative to identify issues. So I think I'd be happy to work with DCP, and we can kind of distribute some resources after this meeting to make sure that we're getting the word out as much as possible about these different resources to protect tenants in rent stabilized housing.
Great, thank you. All right, next question is, the proposed rezoning would allow developers to pay into a housing opportunity fund if the new building is less than 12,500 square feet. How does HPD calculate the amount of the payment into the fund? A city like Boston requires a payment of $380,000 per low income unit in wealthy zones? What does New York City require in SoHo, NoHo?
Great question. So the Affordable Housing Fund, as you noted, is available for certain smaller new residential buildings. The fee is laid out, and the methodology that we use to construct the fee, I believe, is laid out through a rule, though I hope I did not just get that incorrect and can follow up if we did, which is available on the mandatory inclusionary housing page of our website. But the underlying math behind that fee and the underlying goal is that the fee reflects the full cost of providing affordable housing units in the neighborhood in question, which in a neighborhood like SoHo, NoHo, given the value for the city to acquire sites, could be close to $1 million per unit. It could be very expensive. I don't know the exact number, but it'd be very expensive because the fee reflects the full cost of providing units in the neighborhood in question. So far, all qualifying developers have simply provided the units on site. If developers do choose to use the fund, contributions to that fund will be reserved for use in the same community district for 10 years and within the borough after 10 years if a suitable site within the community district were not able to be found within 10 years.
Thanks, Michael. All right, on to two speakers. First, we'll have Santi Scardillo and then Sheena Kang. So Santi, just to let you know, your Zoom screen might close out and pop back up again as we enable the mic and camera.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Well, I can't believe I finally got on. I was getting quite irked by how my question was the second one and it had to be this long. So I apologize for all my talk on the chat. And excuse me if I will take a few more seconds due to this interjection. From the data and the plans presented, I don't see any real concern for people who already live in the area on meager incomes, never mind newcomers. I question the $1,000 monthly operating cost of each unit and would like to know what data Michael Sandler at HPD based that on. And as far as producing units, you don't include how many units Houston and other cities in your graph, quote, produced in the 1920s. According to your data, New York City produced 700,000. I live in a building of the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And the city's agencies should change radically and recognize the people's wisdom and base their criteria for such plans on it. The very reason there is a NoHo and SoHo today is community action brought by artists of the Fluxus movement and activists such as Mary Jane Jacobs. If it had been for the city plans of that time brought by Robert Moses, SoHo would be an expressway today. So when you talk about 30 to 50 years in terms of planning, you should really keep in mind what the people can contribute and just put on data. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll start and clarify some of the data questions. So the monthly cost to operate was based on the 2020 Rank Guidelines Board report. They issue an annual report that informs increases to rent stabilization. That was the the income and expenses report 2020. And so that was the average cost to maintain a rent stabilized building in New York City, and the methodology behind that study is all available on the Rent Guidelines Board website. you're right that the different cities shown in that chart were developed at different times and are kind of at different points in their history, and that much of New York City and the expansion into the outer boroughs, did occur in the 20th century, hence 700,000 new units in 20 years. That slide is meant to illustrate that, in the past, New York City has risen to the challenge of housing shortages and has created new housing that met the needs of the moment. And I think there are many folks who say that New York City can't build our way out of this problem. And certainly I'm sensitive to the neighborhood character and folks' experience in their communities. I live in a neighborhood that I love, and I certainly would want to make sure that I continue to live in a quality neighborhood, and I really respect neighborhood activists and their work that they do. That said, the idea that we just simply can't build enough housing for what we need is disproven by our city's own history. And some of these historic buildings that we love were built at other periods where we needed more housing, and we built a lot of it. And I don't know if, Sylvia, there's anything else you want to add about the community process. I think we covered it.
I think we got it.
Great, thank you. All right, next speaker is Sheena Kang.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you guys so much for the very informative presentations tonight and for continuing this process, even during difficult times. I personally love the virtual format, so I'll just put my props out there for that. I am with the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, and we do have a couple questions regarding the FARs for commercial uses that are proposed in the draft scope of work. As we saw in Michael's presentation, mapping MIH in SoHo, NoHo would allow for New Yorkers with much lower incomes than the average SoHo resident to live in the area. But that's assuming that the rezoning does facilitate new housing. And obviously we want to maximize those opportunities. So the commercial FARs proposed in the draft scope are very generous, and we're slightly concerned that that could instead incentivize the creation of new office buildings and other commercial uses over residential development. So I'm wondering if DCP is exploring options to lower the commercial FARs from those proposed in the draft scope, especially in the housing opportunity zones, the SoHo East and West areas. And if not, what other strategies to maximize residential development are being looked at?
Thank you, Sheena. Thanks for your question. It's a good one, and that came up at the scoping meeting as well, and many of the scoping comments. As I mentioned earlier, given the various planning goals here in SoHo, NoHo, we want to make sure that we are maximizing housing production while also supporting SoHo, NoHo as a job center and mixed-use district over the long term. I'll note that, in our experience in other areas that we've allowed both residential or commercial, like, kind of on equal footing, like Lion City and downtown Brooklyn, we have not seen commercial developments trumping residential, but I'll say that we recognize that those areas do not have an MIH requirement, and we hear you that the market dynamics may be different here. That is to say that it is an issue that we continue to analyze, and we'll make sure that we're getting the balance right. Thanks for the comment.
Thank you, Sylvia. So we're going to move on to two more written questions. I just want to say that it's 5 minutes to 8:30, and so we'll be taking a few more questions. And this has been great. We're really glad to see this robust discussion. So let me ask the first question. This is from someone writing on behalf of the American Institute of Architects in New York. Our offices are just outside the proposed rezoned area, and we strongly support the rezoning. During its revisions, is the city considering how and where to add additional housing beyond what was initially proposed, particularly affordable and supportive housing?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for writing on behalf of AIA. I will note that I think your question is really about whether upzoning is part of the neighborhood plan, and I'll say that considered increases in density where appropriate is part of the is an important component of the neighborhood plan. I think it is critical to remember that we are in a citywide housing crisis, and we need to increase the amount of housing out there, market rate and affordable. So here in SoHo, NoHo, as was mentioned, that among all of the levers the city have, here we have tools we can play with. One is, we want to consider what is the right density for SoHo, NoHo and different areas within SoHo, NoHo to kind of unlock development potential and produce housing. And two is about, creating the right environment for MIH to work. So on density, I'll speak a little bit to kind of our proposal and the intent. As I mentioned, we are still developing and fine tuning the proposal. So there's room to, kind of make a few changes as the plan develops. But the overall approach here is that, we know that existing zoning permits buildings to be developed to 5 to 6.5 FAR. Essentially, that's comparatively low compared, if we look at other, similarly transit accessible, centrally located neighborhoods. It is, important to remember that most existing buildings in these neighborhoods were developed well before the M15A and B zoning was put in place. And many have densities beyond the maximum allowable 6.5 right now, especially along portions of Broadway and parts of NoHo. So taken this historic and existing built condition into consideration, which I'm sure, architects and designers will appreciate, along with other factors such as access to transit, jobs, and other amenities, as well as the presence of multiple wide streets and thoroughfares, and upzoning of certain parts of SoHo, NoHo along corridors in those, within those areas appropriate, will play, a big role in unlocking housing potential. I think that's it.
Thanks, Sylvia. Next question is upzoning an integral part of this planning proposal?
Right, I think I did answer that.
Okay, great. We will move on to the speakers. So next we have Carter Booth. Carter, just be aware that your Zoom screen will close out and pop back up to enable the mic and camera.
It's nice to see everybody. I had two questions. The first was there's some questions in the chat. I've posed this directly to you guys before, but you've collected every single email address of everybody who has participated since 2019 in the Envision SoHo NoHo process. Have you advertised these meetings and sent out emails to all of the past participants in the meetings? Number one, since this is switched to an online format. And number two, Eric Botsford had said at the last public meeting that there was only one affordable housing tool in the toolkit, and that was MIH. And Sylvia, I believe that you had said that this was the most useful tool in the toolkit for affordable housing. So I'm just wondering if you guys could comment on that, and if you can discuss what affordable housing tools the city has at its disposal in looking at these situations other than MIH. Obviously, MIH has a lot of controversy And I think that Eric had said it was the only tool available, and you had said, you seem to mention that there are others. So I was wondering if you guys could just comment on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Carter. I will address the first question first. One, I think in terms of getting the word out, we do rely on, our local partners and former members of the Envision SoHo NoHo advisory group and, the community board to help spread the word. We know that the council member and the borough president's offices have been, helping on that front as well. With regards to kind of sending emails to folks that we have email addresses for. I'll note that, it is something that we are considering and need to get, kind of further clarity on, because I think a lot of the emails that we have are people who, kind of came to our prior meetings and sign up for as part of Envision SoHo NoHo. It may or may not, I think we are reluctant to send out emails and proactively reach out to people that way without them knowing that providing us the email addresses in earlier events will actually, it doesn't indicate to us that they were notified that they're going to get additional communications from us. But I think that's a good suggestion, and we are considering that and reaching out to people that way. In terms of the second question, the city's housing tools, I think Michael's presentation actually covered a lot of this. So I will kind of ask Michael to come on and speak to it. What I will say is that, I think the city has a wide variety of strategies in terms of preserving existing affordable housing as well as creating new affordable housing. But SoHo NoHo has a lot of constraints, and some tools may work better than others. So I think he mentioned in his part of the presentation that, while the city has, public financing tools and levers to support the preservation and creation of affordable housing, given the high land costs and market rents, those financing tools and levers are not as feasible. And then, another important tool that the city has is to develop 100% affordable housing on city-owned land. Here in SoHo NoHo, again, we really don't have city-owned developable land. So other than the 2 DEP sites that are water shaft sites, we do have, as Emily mentioned earlier, 2 Howard Street, which is a federal government-owned site. We are not the federal government, but we are looking into that site and try to see, whether there's a possibility to develop that. I think here, what we do have control over and have, at our disposal is one, changing the zoning to allow housing first and foremost and increase density appropriately, and 2, to require permanent affordable housing via mandatory inclusionary housing on private sites. Michael, I don't know whether you have additional things to add here.
I don't have a ton to add. I think Sylvia did a great job of running through the issues. As Sylvia said, MIH is one of many tools, but for a neighborhood like SoHo NoHo, it is the most important tool that we have. So, the city offers loans and tax incentives to facilitate the preservation of existing affordable housing and the creation of new affordable housing, but those tools are very difficult to use here. When the city talks about preserving affordable housing, there's a variety of tools we use in addition to financing to protect tenants and ensure housing quality for tenants and for homeowners and low-income homeowners. And we have a wide variety of tools to do this, most of which are really not applicable in SoHo NoHo because of the extremely high cost of housing in this neighborhood, make it very difficult for the city's financing tools to work here. But those tenant protection activities and other tools at the city's disposal are relevant here for SoHo, in addition to MIH. And I'll also note that we talked a little bit about housing vouchers, and we didn't talk about them much, but housing vouchers are an important affordable housing tool, and households that have a housing voucher would be able to access MIH apartments in this neighborhood at a slightly higher AMI tier than their actual income by using those vouchers. And so vouchers plus MIH together actually work very well to allow extremely low income families to access neighborhoods like SoHo.
Thanks, Michael and Sylvia. Next speaker we'll have is Bill Rosser. Bill, are you on? Are you unable to unmute yourself? Okay, it looks like we can't get a hold of Bill. So let's move on to William Thomas.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. I can actually start my video too. Sorry, I'm just trying to minimize my screen. Okay. So hi everyone. My name is Will Thomas. I live in the East Village. I just want to thank you guys for tonight's presentation. Surprisingly, I rarely hear the facts of the housing crisis laid out in these rezoning hearings. So I really appreciate HPD and DCP starting it out this way. I learned a lot from tonight's presentation, like the specific breakdown of housing in SoHo. So again, kudos there. I wanted to ask a simple question. It seems like a lot of thought has gone into allowing greater integration through MIH. But I wanted to ask if you guys are planning on coordinating with the Department of Education on school integration and just sort of like the plans there. I know there are a lot of moving parts, but it would just be nice to hear sort of like what the plans are there, because obviously that's a big part of any integration push here in SoHo. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Will, for your question. And it is a good question and an important one. And it did come up in some of the scoping comments. I think that's something that we will look into and follow up. Unfortunately, I'm not, an expert on initiatives at DOE, but what I will say is that by, kind of introducing more housing and allowing more housing and affordable housing in SoHo, NoHo, where there are, schools and other good amenities and opportunities that a neighborhood offer, we hope to, overall support integration and diversification of the neighborhood and also this, school-age children population. But we'll follow up on that.
Thanks, Sylvia. All right, so it's 8:40 now. We really want to respect everyone's evening. So we'll go ahead and take one more question. We really appreciate everyone's attendance and participation. And again, I know we weren't able to get through everyone's questions, but All questions will be posted on the website in the next few days, and you'll be able to find responses in our frequently asked questions section on our website at nyc.gov/SoHo NoHo plan. So it looks like Bill Rosser is back. So let's try this again.
Okay, everybody, thanks so much. So my question is, why can't we build in NoHo a 100% affordable housing unit and with limited heights that fit in with the historical architectural character of the area, and put that in, and maybe it needs subsidization. Maybe there's small units per apartment, but that would accomplish so many things. Let's add housing. In my area, I live in NoHo, I live in Lafayette Street. There were 4 new buildings within 200 feet of my building within the last 5 or 10 years. They restrict themselves to height. They're making money. We have a parking lot across the street. That parking lot across the street could be 100% affordable housing. I would welcome that. And now, if it takes money to support that, subsidize that, let's go for it. Figure out how to do that. The idea of the MIH is causing a disaster in terms of many other areas. So let's change that and look for other opportunities to build 100% affordable housing across the street, limited height, in NoHo and other areas, and make it go that way. What's wrong with that?
That is a great question and an important question. And we talked about it a little bit in the presentation, and I'll kind of reiterate here. The city has spent literally billions of dollars in subsidy to create 100% affordable housing in neighborhoods around the city. Government assisted affordable housing requires a partner. This is privately owned housing, and that parking lot you speak of is privately owned land, I believe, unless it's the GSA parking lot you're referring to. But that parking lot is privately owned land. We don't own that, and so in order to make that affordable housing, we need to come up with an amount of subsidy that is agreeable to the owner of that site, who has a massive amount of upside. Unfortunately, in the alternative of not working with the city. So the city does provide significant amounts of subsidy, over $100,000 per development unit, in addition to layering in state and federal subsidies to create 100% affordable buildings. As I said in the presentation, we have done this to the tune of 52,000 times, 53,000 units in the last 7 years around the city. And we do this where we have willing partners who are able to work with the city to do this. We do subsidize affordable housing even in this neighborhood, just across the street from NoHo. We work with the Cooper Square CLT where there is existing 100% affordable housing. We've recently added new buildings to this, but this is where we had an element, where we had a hook, where we had an ability to work with an owner to get a building into this affordable housing ecosystem. And we don't have that for the privately owned land in SoHo, given the structure of property ownership that we have in the United States. So here in SoHo right now, the tool that we have is to mandate affordable housing for any new housing that does get built, rather than really that 100%. Now, if we had property owners in the SoHo NoHo area that want to work with HPD on subsidy, we would love to hear from them. And I think that you know where to find us.
Great, thanks, Michael. And with that, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all so much for attending. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to participate. We hope that you will join us for our future sessions. Our next session will be held on February 25th and will focus on SoHo NoHo as mixed-use neighborhoods and quality of life issues. More event information and registration will be posted soon on our website at nyc.gov/SoHo NoHo plan. And again, this session, the video presentation and questions asked will be also posted on the website in the next few days. If you do have further questions, feel free to email us at soho-noho@planning.nyc.gov. Have a good night. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.